I will try to show how what the fathers did is very important, in my opinion, for also postmodernity and to understand what we are living, for economics and many things, and most of all for what the Pope Francis is saying and trying to do in the church. So my talk has three main points. First of all, I would try to show the roots in Greek metaphysics of negative theology. We already listened yesterday to Riccardo Chiaradonna with a lot of details and interesting things. Here is just some hints, because I want to show how this negative theology in Greek metaphysics is rooted in the tension between the one and the many. That is the core of the metaphysical problem, and I think from the Trinitarian perspective, the foundation of theology. Because of that, these tensions in Greek metaphysics were addressed fully only in the thought of the fathers, of the first Christian thinkers, and their version of negative theology is different with respect to what Plato and the others developed, with many points of contacts. This is very interesting. And the last part will be to try to show why this version developed by the fathers could be very useful nowadays for the challenges of postmodernity. Because of that, the talk has three main parts: philosophy, fathers, and postmodernity. And the arrows should go from 1 to 2, from 2 to 3, but the program is changing the order. But you can imagine is a kind of negative solution so do the contrary of what you think and you get the right answer. Okay. Yesterday, John Milban started from Keats and poetry, and I was very happy also because I think that in poetry we have a source of negative theology, I would say, because in my perspective, and not only mine, literature always speaks about Christ, maybe unconsciously, but the heart of the human being is always in tension towards the infinite. And because of that, when you write something and what you wrote get to many people, many human beings in different ages and times, that means that it's talking about Christ, maybe in a dialectical perspective, but there is always Christ behind that. So Robert Frost wrote 2 verses: "We dance around in a ring and suppose, but the secret, with capital S, sits in the middle and knows." We would call the secret the mystery from the theological perspective, but it's very interesting to see how in the heart of the poet who suffered a lot in his life, there is this secret who knows. And in a completely different tradition, Tagore wrote these verses that I like a lot: "Water in a vessel shimmers, water in the sea obscure. Small truth speaks in words that are clear. Great truth bears great silence." So the fact that silence is related to deeper truths is something very interesting, and maybe it could be the starting point of what we are saying with philosophy. This poetical beginning is connected to what Plato thought about writing. And I think that it's very useful for the situation we are living with the cloud, internet, and so on, because the myth of Theos is about writing, and this gift, with the ambivalent value of gift in the antiquity, that was writing itself, proposed by the god Theos to the king of Egypt, and the king refused, didn't accept this gift, because in this way, through writing, men should start remembering from without and not from within. And this is something very interesting that Plato is giving to us, is a very good heritage, I would say, that we should keep in mind, because the signs are always symbols to a deeper level. And this is something that Plato is explaining very well. also through the structure of some of his dialogues. For example, I love Lysid, because of the topic. It's about friendship. So what is friendship? And it's a very interesting question. The structure of the dialogue is constructed in such a way that is cyclical. So you get to an aporetic solution, because A implies B, but B cannot be accepted, and B implies C, but C cannot be accepted, but C implies A. So in the end, you are in a circle. At the very final of the dialogue is Socrates asking Lysid and Menesseno, I don't know in English how it's said, what a strange thing, friends. We cannot define friendship, but we are friends. And so the meaning is that there is something behind what we can express that is deeper and is truth. And because of that, negative theology somehow is there. Theology was used first for metaphysics. So the idea is that what we see is rooted in something that is beyond. But when we think of Greek metaphysics, we should take into account that they are moving in a different metaphysical architecture with respect to what we do, because for them there was just one ontological level combined by God and the Word that were united by a kind of ladder, and both God and the Word were finite and eternal. For us, it's shocking because we're used to think that God is infinite and eternal, while we are finite and temporal. But in the Greek view, both God and the Word were somehow connected because both were finite and eternal. So what we get in this version of negative theology in Greek metaphysics is a kind of what I call a K-apophatism, where K is for knowledge. So what Plato was saying is that the subject should go always beyond, and the limitations in knowledge were due to the subject itself. On the contrary, when we move to the Christian view, we have a gap between God and the Word, because the Word is finite and God is infinite. And because of that, we have a B-apophatism, that is being apophatism. That means that the very object is infinite and cannot be known perfectly because it's too rich. It's a kind of source apophatism, it could be also called, but I don't want to create too many expressions. What is terribly important is that being and intelligible, according to the Christian view, are distinct, do not coincide in an automatic way. God is always convertible with truth and knowledge because he's God, but the created realities are not convertible with truth because are created, just participate in truth. And because of that, we get the problem, this difference of the perspectives brings the problem of how to show the origin of everything from the first cause. Because in the Greek myths, we always have a couple, an original couple, and we get a fight between the original couple or the father and the children. For example, we have Uranus and the fight with Kronos who eats his children, and so on. So we always have a dialectical tension between the one and the many, because the word is rooted in a couple, in the two, not in the one. In the Enuma Elish is the same. So sorry for the stupid image, but when I read the Greek myths and the ancient narratives, it's like watching The Godfather. So we are always talking about some fights of some families, dysfunctional families. So in the development of philosophy of metaphysics, the first phase was characterized by a dyad that could be, for example, form and matter. And this dyad is the responsible of the tension between God and the world. That means that to be different means to be inferior with respect to God. There is always a dialectical tension within the world because it cannot be distinguished by God through this gap of this ontological gulf. In my opinion, through the dialogue between Greek metaphysics and Christianity, and before that, Judaism with Philo, little by little, in Middle Pythagoreanism, we had a shift from this dualism to a true monism that implied emanations or the stress of the diversity between God and the world, and the fact that what is characterized by the multiplicity is inferior. Oh, so we lose the Greek here, but it doesn't matter. On the contrary, when we read the Bible, just from the first verse, we discover that everything comes from the one, from God. There is no couple, but there is one God who creates what? A couple. Even more, many couples, because we have heavens and earth, and then we have the water above and the water below, and then we go through all creation till male, women and men. So in this case, the couple is not dialectical because there is the one who keeps the relations of this couple together. And because of that, we have a wonderful structure in Christian metaphysics, what the fathers did, that could be very useful nowadays, in my opinion, when we see tensions again between the one and the many in our cultures. That took a lot of work to the fathers to develop these categories, because, for example, Justin, who was a philosopher, and knew very well Platonism and Stoicism, tried to put the logos between the Father and the Word, like a Platonic eros. But in the end, this solution had many shortcomings because the logos was inferior to the Father in this way. And because of that, the Cappadocians, through Athanasius, Origen, and so on, succeeded in moving the logos within the Trinity. So beyond that gap, that ontological gap, the arrow again should go from in between to within God himself. But in Justin, we have some tensions that are also very interesting because, for example, he says that God is the first principle, as is obvious, but because of that, he's ineffable, because nobody can impose a name on the Father of the universe. It is the Father who imposed the name of the Son. So if the Father is the first principle, there is no previous principle who can give a name to him. And because of that, the words that we use, for example, Father, God, Creator, Lord, Master, and so on, don't designate the essence of the Father, but the benefits and the works. So we have a clear affirmation of apophasis, and at the same time, also there is the indication of the line of development that would be very interesting in the first century, that says that the language can catch the economy, the action, the manifestation, but not being itself, because being is always beyond language. This is very, very strong. And for example, in Justin, in the dialogues with Trypho, there is something shocking for us. I was recalling it during our lunch with TJ White, and we were discussing with John Milbank and him about Aquinas. Because if you read Justin, he says that the Father is aperigraptos. That means that he cannot be defined. On the contrary, when we talk about a person, we are always talking about perigraphe, so something that is delimited. So person is related to finitude. On the contrary, the Father, that is the first principle, cannot be described, cannot be circumscribed. And Clement follows this line. He says that the Logos is san kata perigraphen, but not katusian. So the problem is a serious problem. Because of that, once I was discussing with a colleague of mine from the Faculty of Philosophy, and he told me that it's obvious that God is a person, and Aquinas shows it very clearly with this syllogism. God is the sum of all perfection. Being a person is a perfection. God is a personal. The point is, it doesn't work from a historical point of view, because we know that being a person is a perfection only through revelation. So I think that it's very interesting to reread Aquinas from the Fathers of the Church, because we can understand also the tensions that we are experiencing now in the situation that we are living. My conclusion of this part is that only the Trinity is eternally infinite, and there is a gap between God and the Word. Because of that, we have to change our conception of knowledge, because the full meaning of the word is not in the word itself, it's not immanent to the word, but is immanent in God, is the Son. So the divine sonship, divine filiation, is the meaning of whatever we see and whatever exists. Because of that, the end of theology is not to define God, but to work on the relationship between God and the Word. That's what we can study. And because of that, faith itself is not a secondary form of knowledge, a kind of doxa that we should use when episteme is impossible, but it's the deepest form of knowledge, because it's knowledge through relation. Augustine says that to believe is cum assenzione cogitare, is thinking through a yes. So it's something wonderful. And in the Fathers, we see all the tensions, all the work to overcome the classical Greek framework. In Origin, we still keep a kind of subordination within the Trinity. So it's not a real subordination, it's verbal, but he has no means to express how the Father, the Son, and the Spirit are distinct within the one substance. And Arius and his heresies comes from this tension, because both the Arians and the Fathers were saying origin is the source of my thought. And it was true somehow, because Arius secularized origin. In my perspective, Arius did something similar to what Hegel did in modern times, but this is maybe too daring to say, but here we can say it. So where is the source of Christian negative theology? In my opinion, is in the very gospel. For example, in the prologue of John, we see that there is a wonderful chiastic structure, so the beginning and the end do correspond each other, and there is a path coming out from God, and that has a center in incarnation, that the path goes back into God. And so if we put in parallel the beginning and the end, we see that in the end, John calls the arche, the beginning, the principle, the Father. And he calls the Logos the Son, the only Son of God. And also he says that because of that, no one has ever seen God, and only through the Son we can get to know God from within, not from without. So we can know only through a relation, through the second divine person who became incarnate, who is a relation in himself. And because of that, I think that there is something very interesting in the structure of the prologue itself that is trying to keep together the Greek story, the Greek word, culture, and the Hebrew one. Because we have an arche, which does correspond to Bereshit, the beginning of Genesis, Logos, which corresponds to Dabar, because it's a living word. And then even we could put in parallel the proston, the fact that the word is towards the Father, that the Son is towards the Father, with the very idea of covenant, is the Jewish way of expressing the relationship with God. So in my language, I talk of a relational ontology that is the very source of negative theology. where I use ontology not in a Heideggerian sense, but as a bigger group, a wider category, which has in itself metaphysics as the kind of ontology that tries to discover the foundation of what is metaphysica, so that is behind the cosmic world. On the contrary, through revelation, we can look what is behind, for example, man, tantropica. We know freedom, for example. The Greek word didn't know freedom because of that they had slavery. So we are used to think of the ancient times from Christian lenses, but maybe what is happening now is helping us to discover that what happened in those times was pretty tough because we are experiencing again something barbarian and so on. We are killing children and we are doing strange things. But we should keep in mind that the value of the human being comes from Christianity. And I admire a lot what Origen did, because he had in mind the role of freedom and stressed a lot the role of freedom. For example, Celsus told him, it was not a real dialogue because Celsus wrote before, so they never met. But the criticism of Celsus on Christianity was that Jesus died because the prophets foretold that he would have died. But Origen showed that it wasn't like that. The causal error doesn't go from the prophet to Christ, but on the contrary, the prophet in what is a time before Christ speaks with God who lives in eternity, that is in eternal today, and because of that is contemporary somehow to the cross that is after the prophet. And because of that, the relation of the prophet with God shows to the prophet what is going to happen with respect to him. So the causal error goes from Christ to the prophet. And this is clear, from this example, in my opinion, is clear that we are working in a wider ontology with respect to metaphysics, an ontology of freedom that is deeply interesting. And because of that, Gregory can say that we cannot know God, not because we are poor, but because God is rich. So we are talking about the infinite itself. This text from the Vita Moisis, so it's a mystical text, is very interesting. That which truly exists is true life. And this is inaccessible to knowledge, true life. So it's not just being, it's a living being. Learn from what has been said that the deity, by its very nature, is incomprehensible because it's not bound by any limit. In fact, if we thought the deity as having some limitations, it would be necessary to justly consider, together with the limit, what lies beyond this limit. I cannot show this now, but behind this reasoning, there is the core of what will become the Gödel theory. So what put into crisis the formalism of modern logic is just this point, the concept of infinite. If you don't have a real infinite, it doesn't work at all. And what I like in Gregory is that he also speaks of a created apophatism, in the sense that we cannot understand the very nature of an ant, and even more, we cannot understand the nature, we cannot express the nature of God, because the reason of creation is in God, is the word of God. And I will just tell quickly what is in this wonderful text in Incanticum, because Gregory says that even the angels cannot see and know the Trinity, because they are creature, they are finite, and when the bride meets the friends of the bridegroom, that Gregory interprets as the angels, a wonderful reading, neither the angels knows the very nature of God. On the contrary, and this is striking, it's wonderful, when I read it, I understood what I was reading for the first time. I got moved. The very angels get to know something of God through the bride, because the bride is the body of Christ. So the only way to get to the Trinity is through the church, is through the body of Christ. And this says much about ecclesiology also, and how we cannot think of the church without Christ, and we cannot think of the Trinity without the church, and so on, and without liturgy. So everything is one in theology because it's relational. Gregory of Nazianzus, in this way, get to draw a first version of the psychological analogy, because he compares the processions, the immanent processions, to what happens in us. And the reason that makes possible this kind of reasoning is just the gap. It's just negative theology. So through negative theology, we can say a lot about the human being, a lot about the word, just because we recognize that the word is different with respect to God, but is rooted in God itself. And this is also something very useful nowadays, I would say. So the only way to get to know God is through incarnation. And the very shaded bed in the Canticum is read as a prophecy of incarnation, according to Gregory, because no one can see God, but we can only know something about God through shadows, through the veil of incarnation. So the veil reveals. This is wonderful. And this brings us to postmodernity, because I think that in postmodernity, we fear what was imposed to us in modernity, and all the fights that came from this reduction of reality to ideas. And so we can fight only on ideas, because we are real human beings, and it's only idolatry that brings us to fight and to war. In reality, we are connected. We are one body, really one body. So we are doing something stupid when we fight, even in the church, even in different confessions. For example, ecumenism is not an act of mercy. Okay, I'm a good believer, and so I do ecumenism, or I speak with atheists. You cannot but doing that if you believe in the Trinity, because our God is a relational God. And so he's open and opens us, our hearts. And we see, because we are in the Pontifical Academy of Theology, and we think also together about the method of theology and what a theologian should do, I think that it's very interesting to look from the perspective of postmodernity and what Pope Francis is saying to us, to these two texts. The first one by Gregory of Nyssa in Inscriptiones Psalmorum. In fact, I quote, "What God is by nature remains inaccessible to human nature and incomprehensible, in that it ineffably rises in flight beyond the reasoning of man. The language is Platonic, but a certain imprint of ineffable nature arises through the virtues like a shady sketch in those who turn their gaze to it." So if you look at the divine nature, you get something. So all knowledge and wisdom and science and approach to conceptual understanding are not the divine wings, this is Plato, but the shadow of the divine wings. And this, while a shadow, is a great benefit to us. So we should follow the shadow of the divine wings. And this is very interesting if you read it from the perspective of the cave myth of Plato, because the idea of Plato was that we should leave the shadow to know through the light. And what Gregory says, that God is infinite, so we should do just the contrary, look at the shadows of God, of the wings of God in creation through his actions. And we get to this extraordinary, terrific, wonderful definition of the best theologian in Gregory of Nazianzus, in the Oratio de Filio. In our opinion, the best theologian is not the one who has understood the whole, for the limit doesn't contain the whole, but he's the one who has been able to imagine more than others and more unite within himself the mental image of truth or a shadow of it, or whatever we could like to call it. So again, the shadow, and also the verb, this unite within himself recalls the cymballo in Luke about Mary and her thought. I've discovered preparing this paper something that I like a lot because of that I share it with you. So this is a text loved by Joseph Ratzinger. Gregory says that we cannot, talking about Moses, that we cannot know God even if we meet him face to face, and Bart yesterday told a lot about this, but we can just follow God, so we can see the back of God. And the picture you had was wonderful. And but this is already present in Pythagoras, the epotheo, so we can just go behind God. And divinization is to go behind God. Philo applied it to Abraham and to Moses, Gregory to Moses, and in Augustine, in the Trinitate, is present, this instant tradition, and he interprets it as incarnation. So to go behind God is to follow incarnation. And I think that is very useful. Joseph Ratzinger, in Introduction to Christianity, comments on John 7:16, mea doctrina non est mea, highlighting how it's paradoxical, because how is possible that what is mine is not mine? And he stresses that the point is that the I doesn't belong to you, because you have received it. And because of that, what is most yours isn't yours. So you are in a relation. And the conclusion of Ratzinger is that we should develop metaphysics, adding the dimension of relations to the dimension of substance. And I think that he was prophetic, and we are trying to take seriously what he said. I don't understand why he was portrayed as a rightist when he's just the contrary from a theological perspective. I skipped to the end, sorry. I just wanted to tell you that according to Dionysius, God is also small in a symbolic theological approach, that we keep this negative theology in John of Damascus, and there is someone here who knows very well this. And I think that John of Damascus deserves more attention, because in some cases, we say that he was a compiler, but he's the link with Middle Age. And I think that the synthesis that he made between philosophy and theology is something very interesting. We see here that according to John of Damascus, neither the angels can know God, as Gregory said. So the Cappadocian theology is here. But I wanted to end with John of Damascus, because in his synthesis, that is everything but a compilation, in my opinion, as we know, he developed the concept of perichoresis, applying it to the Trinity, because the first use of perichoresis was in Christology by Gregory of Nazianzus. Then Maximus the Confessor applied it to divinization. So just as the human nature of Christ is in the divine nature and the reverse, so we are in God and God is in us. And because of that, John of Damascus, doing something that is deeply Trinitarian theological, says the root of that is the very perichoresis of the three divine person, because the Father is in the Son and in the Spirit, and so on. So what we have here, maybe we have just we can understand why Gregory of Nyssa and Gregory of Nazianzus were talking about shadows, because we cannot get to know God in itself. We are not within God with our thought, but God is within us, really. So we cannot understand God with our head, but we can have God in our heart, as Saint Jose Maria Escrivá used to say, who is the founder of the institution that ran this university. And this is a very good synthesis, I would say, because in the created world, through negative theology, we can get to recognize a syntaxis. So the relational dimension of the word that is so because word was created by a Trinitarian God. And that helps us to recognize that the word is symbolic and that the triplice via, via eminentia, via negationis, via affirmationis, is very effective if we start theologically thinking that God is a source. The first cause is a source. Because of that, the via negationis, Teologia negativa, is not dialectical. It's not just logical, but is relational. And so we get to a via affirmationis that is not dangerous as modernity fear, because modernity exposed us to a just logical truth. On the contrary, we need an ontological truth. We need being apophatism. And we can get it through the example of Mary, I would say, because if we think ontologically, Mary, the Mother of God, we get something extraordinary. Because, for example, Gregory of Nyssa says that the burning bush is a prophecy of incarnation. It's not incarnation, it's not the Logos there, as Justin said, but is a prophecy of the Mother of God and his purity. So Mary is burning, is life so intense that is burning. And in herself, God incarnated. So God was within Mary physically. And because of that, Mary is within the Trinity physically in the Assumption. So we get, I think, a wonderful picture that doesn't seem ecumenical, because I'm talking a lot about the Mother of God. But if we read this picture through negative theology and this relational proposal, it gets ecumenical. I tell in the last minute something that happened here in Rome in a very good restaurant. I was with an Anglican and an Irishman, and they were discussing. And the Anglican said that Reformation was about having a personal and not institutional relationship with Jesus. And the Irish answered in front of me, but you, dear friend, cannot have a personal relationship with Jesus because you don't have Mary. And I was shocked because I told them, please, it's my job. I'm the priest, I'm the theologian, I'm the referee. Also, my dress is perfect, you know? So let me talk. And I went to my mom, as usually when I'm in crisis, and I told them, do you know, I'm a professor and I'm a priest, so I have an institutional relationship with many people. But according to my mom, for my mom, I'm her baby, not her son, her baby. So she has the most non-institutional and personal relationship with me. And because of that, I would say that Mary has the most personal and non-institutional relationship with Jesus. So she's the more Lutheran, somehow, person in history. And that settled the conflict in that moment. But I think that we can also take advantage of what we know about Mary from the ontological perspective. And this can help a lot the unity of the churches and also our task of theologians. Thanks a lot.